Well, for more on how world leaders can address the refugee crisis, I spoke to Don Flynn. He's director of the Migrants' Rights Network. I asked who else other than the UN he thinks should be stepping up to address the issue.
The critical role in addressing these problems actually comes from governments. It really is governments that have the resources in the final analysis for doing it, and also have the political influence for being able to bring about real changes. One of the things that really needs to be done is to get a great deal more agreement between governments, is to shoulder to accept the dispersal of refugees. Because at the moment, far too many of them, something like 86% of refugees are concentrated in the very poorest countries in the world, in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. Only, if you take a continent like Europe, only something like 6% of refugees are here. In North America, it's about 14%. Now, this is it's quite unreasonable to expect some of the poorest countries of the world to accept this responsibility. And the longer that it goes on, then the more difficulties it's going to be creating.
In terms of what the UNHCR says its priorities are at the moment, it's the immediate role of the survival needs of refugees being met. How do you think they're doing in that regard?
They're struggling. One reads about the situation of refugees in the Middle East at the moment, in Lebanon, in Jordan and in Turkey. Those who are in the refugee camps, which are run by the UNHCR and the other agencies, the Red Cross and similar bodies. The food relief that is available to people there amounts to $15 a month per person. Now, this is a desperate situation. People can just about survive in terms of their calorie intake on that. But as soon as they start encountering bad weather, when illnesses begin to rip across the refugee camps, long-term malnourishment has a major effect. You start seeing illnesses, very serious illnesses, getting a grip on refugee populations. And children in particular suffer greatly as a consequence of this. We start seeing a rise in the death toll. So, the UNHCR is definitely struggling. It needs a great deal more support in order to be able to carry out its most basic mission of providing relief to people in the camps.
Now, we have seen for years that countries for decades have been pledging this amount, these different amounts of money in order to try and stem the refugee crisis in war-torn countries. But what is the UN actually doing to make sure that those pledges turn into real action on the ground?
Well, there's a huge gap. Something in the region of between 10–20% of the pledges actually ever realised in terms of cash flows becoming available in order to provide the relief that's needed. And it really is a problem, because the United Nations is not a sovereign body. It's not in a position to lay down laws which bind governments, makes them obliged to obey. It's very much a role of persuasion and cajoling and perhaps possibly naming and shaming countries which are particularly falling down. But in the final analysis, if governments dig their heels in and refuse to come up with the money which they themselves have pledged, then there is little that the UN can directly do about it.
Now, there does seem to be a lot of strategies that they're trying to put in place, whether it's quota systems with the number of refugees being proportionate to the size of economies and populations, making deals with Turkey, all sorts of efforts. So then what can world leaders do between now and the next time they meet in 2017 to make sure that this crisis is somehow either contained or controlled, and they don't just look back on the last year as a wasted year where they didn't make progress?
Well, I think the most important thing that they can do is redouble their efforts to get the resources into relieving the refugee situation, which are desperately needed. I've talked about the situation in the Middle East camps, but even here in Europe, UNHCR has estimated that European governments, which are amongst the richest in the world, are typically only making about 44% of the funding that is needed in order to properly administer to the needs of refugee populations here. And that situation can't be allowed to continue. as long as it is a situation in which large numbers of people go in desperate want, in desperate need, then it's going to be a pretty well unmanageable, ungovernable situation when people find themselves going without the basic needs of life for long periods of time. Then they are obliged to look for other solutions to their problems. And when that happens, when they find that they can't survive in the places where they've been officially sent to, then they will go on the move again. And this is the very issue that the European governments and other governments have been complaining about, that the flows begin to become irregular because people are desperately looking for solutions.